Hey guys, welcome back for some more tutorials. My name is Magnet, and today we're going to be talking about using Mech against Bio and TvT. So I know we've already talked about the other side, using Bio versus Mech. This time we're going to focus on the Mech player, and we're going to be talking a lot about being patient with Mech. Trying to prevent yourself from dying or getting too far behind is really the whole theme behind it, and then pushing your power once you know that you have an advantage, or once you get up to a large enough army that really can't grow any larger, so you need to attack. So the whole idea with Mech against Bio is really just don't die until you have an unstoppable army, and that's a lot of Mech in the other matchups, but TvT is a little bit more difficult because of the mobility of Bio, so we'll talk about different ways to eliminate that and different ways to play out the game if that comes up. So let's just go ahead and jump into the game here. We're going to be watching MVP versus Bunny. MVP really well known for his Mech play for a really long time, kind of doing it back when nobody really did it. So he's a good player to watch and learn from. And Bunny, of course, very up-and-coming Terran, just recently won a Premier Tournament, one of the longest droughts for a foreigner to have won a Premier Tournament in Starcraft 2. So I think it was like almost 2 years, so doing really, really well winning that. MVP just opening up, looks like a Reaper build here, shouldn't be anything too special. Just going to get a little bit of scouting and figure out what's going on. Mech isn't really so much about the openers. You can kind of open however you want. That you can open up with Banshees or Hellion Pressure or whatever. There's a lot of different things you can do, and one thing that I've seen get a little bit popular is kind of the two-factory Blue Flame opener that's kind of common against Zerg. You'll see that every once in a while. But mostly, you need to revolve around the three stages of TvT that we've always talked about, is preventing Reapers, preventing Banshees, and then preventing tanks in that order. So Mech should do pretty well against all of those, assuming you have the right transitions. And it looks like Bunny's just opening up with the Banshee. So shouldn't be anything too wild and out of control. MVP just opening up with these two Reapers here, and note how similar his build order is in comparison to what the one against Zerg would look like as well. So he's got his production lined up to start Hellions. He's also starting a Viking, so it's a little bit different, but he just wants to defend against his Banshee since he knows what's going on. We'll talk about Banshees a lot more later on. This is mostly just about after you get past the openers, what to do. So if you have an opener that's stable, and you already know what to do about Banshees and Reapers and tanks, that are all the three things you really need to be concerned about in the opening game, then you'll be fine. But if not, then I guess look out for more videos here in the very near future. So Bunny's just moving out with a little bit of a pressure here, a couple Banshees, a tank. These are all things that you definitely need to have checks against, so the Vikings are out to stop the Banshee. And also, another thing to really note is that the Raven is on the way. This is something that's going to be really common in Mech openers, is the two Vikings and having a Banshee, or rather a Raven with it as well. And see, these attacks are fairly easy to clean up if you can kill the Banshees. It really is what gives them their strength. And MVP's having a little bit of a hard time here, but I think he should have actually waited for a few more Hellions to come out, and maybe he should have waited so that he can actually kill the Banshees. You can take some damage on this command center if need be, but what I'm getting at here is that the Raven is an integral part of your Mech army, especially later in the game against the Bio, because you can soak up Marauder shots with the PDD. So having the two Vikings and the Raven out is a really good answer, and then you can produce your own Banshees shortly afterward to deal with tanks and whatnot. So the idea here is that the Hellions will deal with the Marines, the tanks, or rather the Vikings can deal with the Banshees, and the Raven can obviously detect them, and it can use point defense drone, it can use auto turrets, all kinds of good stuff. And note that this is also basically a one-base player from Bunny, so this is pretty aggressive, and MVP already had an expansion down, so he can afford to lose a few SCVs, but even still, his unit composition should eventually develop into Hellion, Viking, Raven, maybe tanks if he wants to go that route, but tanks are a little bit slow on most of these Mech openers, so the reason that Bunny does have these faster tanks is because he's just on one base and he has to do a lot of damage with this, and if he doesn't, then it doesn't obviously accomplish a whole lot. So now that he's pushed pushed the Banshees away, then he shouldn't have any problems. He drops the auto turret to deal with the tanks. He's pulling some SCVs here. Granted, Bunny did do some damage. MVP is not in bad shape at all, so it's just going to stabilize into a more normal game. Another tank rallied forward. That was kind of silly, but after this point, once you get your expansion set up is when you want to start adding on your extra buildings. So we can start watching MVP. He's just going to add a command center first. Considering he knows he just held that attack, he can do that. And then after this, he does start adding on his own Banshees like we talked about. So the Banshee Hellion play can be really strong, especially with the Raven and the Viking if they can't ever get your Banshee out of the air. So he's starting to attack a little bit more with these Banshees. He has a lot of Hellions supporting. And the idea here is just to try and decompose his army the best you can with the Banshees, and then head in there with the Hellions a little bit later on. So this is a really strong mech opener, but if they prepare properly, it shouldn't do a whole lot. This is something that you can explore and kind of try out in your own games, but you might not get a ton of work done with it. So the Hellions are coming forward now, trying to deal a little bit of damage to the Marines. They're not going to do a whole lot more because they're not that clumped up. They have a good spread on them, and he gets pushed away, but even still, the income still favors MVP by a lot. And this is where he starts to add his extra factories. So basically he started adding his extra factories once he had his 3rd and 4th gas mining. The first 2 gases will be enough to get the Banshee and get the Raven and a couple Vikings and stuff like that where you're producing Hellions to use your extra minerals. But once these extra 2 gas start to kick in is when you want to add your extra factories, and typically 3 factories on 2 bases is plenty. You can see 2 of them have tech labs and 1 of them has a reactor. It's a good balanced production level. And most of the time you're just going to start going into tanks from here, especially because against Bio, they're going to be on Marine Marauder medevacs, sometimes their own tanks, and basically with Mech you just need to claim position. We harken back to Walking Dead where you just say claimed and you plant your tanks, and from that point on you kind of just zone out as much as you can and you kind of just hold territory as much as you can. You need to defend 3 mining bases for as long as possible until you basically get maxed out, and then when you get maxed out is when you can go. So MVP adding a 4th factory. He's going to start mining from his 3rd base here. And this is where you need to start worrying about things like drops or getting out position from tanks. So that's why these 2 Banshees and the Raven are very handy throughout the game. And the Hellions exploring to figure out what's going on is also a very good addition to this. So note that the first upgrade he gets once he lands his factory on there is Blue Flame. Blue Flame is going to really change the game a lot, especially against a lot of Marines. So his tanks were a little bit slow. This is why he's having to lift his command center right now. You can try to micro your Banshee a little bit, but against Stim Marines you have to be a little bit careful. Right now he's just trying to bait out scans and make Bunny waste his energy on his command centers. And the 1 tank here is something you can focus down with the Banshee so that you can break position pretty easily. But sometimes you might have to deal with silly stuff like this, but it shouldn't get too far out of control. So once you start claiming ground territory is when you're going to have to start thinking about claiming air territory. And this is where adding on a couple of Vikings, getting a lot of turrets around your base is going to be really important. So you can see him starting to add the missile turret ring so that if the Bio player starts to try to drop them all over the place, if you can snipe a medevac or 2 with your Vikings or with your missile turrets or something, then all of a sudden their drops have lost a lot of supply, and you can probably clean it up pretty well with just Hellions, maybe send in your Banshees, maybe a couple tanks back there or something, and you should be fine. But from the meching player's perspective, this is really just all about holding out for as long as possible and not taking game-ending damage from the Bio player. So keep your tanks together, kind of keep them spread out a little bit. You need this Hellion buffer, extra turrets, all this stuff is going to really help out against somebody that wants to just pull you apart. So the Bio player's objectives here should be trying to just peel you apart with multiple drops, multiple run-bys and stuff like that. So you really need to spread out well with your tanks. With your other units, you'll notice that this tank is being supported by the one in the back. He really doesn't lose anything. Also has a Hellbat there. And he's also doing a little bit of Hellbat drops here at the Terran base. So counterattacking potential is definitely available with these Hellions or Hellbats. And fortunately enough for you in the current patch, you can switch back and forth between the 2 as frequently as you'd like. Another thing to note is that Bio also needs to kind of pull your unit composition apart before it gets too strong. So counterattacking with your Hellions is a good way to keep the Bio player back at his base. At least as far as dropping stuff in there, it'll force him to come back into his main. And he might be one of those players that just pulls his entire army to 1 drop. So kind of buying time and whatnot to keep your unit composition alive and keep it building is a really good idea. So another attack coming in here. Again, just falling back to where he has support. Notice the PDDs coming down against the Marauders. Really going to soak up a lot of shots and kind of nullify that. And look at MVP's supply lead right now. It's 144 to 93. So MVP is in great shape right now. If he was able to see the entire army, which this is actually basically it, then he would know that it's probably just time to go. So once you can figure out that you have a much bigger army, or at least when you max out, is the time where you can decide, all right, it's time to go. It's time to just claim position the best I can. And with tanks, especially with Mech, it's pretty simple. If you have to siege, that's when you siege. You shouldn't be sieging it for any other reason other than when they start to charge in here. It's going to be a little bit of a base trade, being slightly annoying, but with the tanks, if you start to get attacked, just siege up all of your tanks, and then from that point on, you can start to leapfrog forward a little bit. So let's say you siege these tanks right here, and then you can unsiege the back ones and kind of move them up a little bit, and you just keep scooting closer and closer and closer until you can get on top of their production, or until they are forced to fight you, in which case they shouldn't get good trades because attacking into siege tanks is never good. So from this point, it's really pretty simple. It's just keeping your Viking count up so you can kill medevacs, keeping your Hellbat and Hellion count up to buffer against the tanks, and the tanks really do most of the work. There's not much of a reason to switch into much else, unless the game goes longer, which I hope that we see in the next game, but if we don't, then we'll be talking about that more so in the late game TvT video that should be coming up here fairly soon. Let's take a look at another replay here really quickly, and this is going to be MVP once again. Like I said, really the best meching player for a really long time. He's going to be fighting MMA, who's a little better bio player. We're going to see him stressed a little more as far as keeping his bases under control. So MVP is up here, and we're going to kind of fast forward through the openers here since we have talked about those a little bit. We'll be talking a lot about those, especially Revolver and Banshees, very soon. So if you're having trouble with Banshee openers, or if you don't really need to know, or rather if you don't know exactly what you're supposed to be doing here in the opening game, we will talk about that at length. So again, the opener is a Reaper here from MVP. I would be surprised to see any sort of different opener than what we saw before, considering it is MVP, and they don't typically vary up their openers too much unless they find a good reason to. So he's going for a little bit of a faster factory, a little bit later of a command center, and a little bit faster starport. So actually I should correct myself. There is a command center on the low ground, so this should be pretty much the same build, so my bad. Going into Banshees here pretty soon, and he has plenty of units here to defend any random move outs. And he won't be pressured as much in the early game from MMA because MMA is just going for a pretty conservative expansion and trying to deal a little bit of damage with his own Hellions, but your own Banshee back at home and your own Hellions should be able to handle these drops and run-bys and whatnot. So MVP is in fine shape. So continuing forward here, I hope that we start to see the later game battlecruiser stuff, but we might not. If I remember this game, I think this is a very base trading game. MMA is really annoying with his bios, so MVP just doing a little bit of damage here. You can try and trade out your Hellions the best you can for SCVs, considering the Hellions don't typically matter a lot in the early game. You just don't want to throw them away for nothing. So just like we saw last game, he's taking his 3rd and 4th gases, he's adding on his factories right now, he's getting his 3rd command center. This is all really normal stuff. Starting up Hellions, he already has these Banshees on the field, at least if he didn't lose them. Actually, he might have, but getting the Raven as well, adding on Vikings, all really normal stuff for TvT. And again, the Raven count, or rather the Raven being there, is very important against these bio plays. From MMA, we can see him transitioning into these tank bio once again, so nothing too crazy going on. And he's just seeking around for any extra Banshees and whatnot. So by this point, you might have some trouble with some tank pushes, especially with the Marines and stuff supporting, considering you can't really use Vikings, you can't really use Banshees. From this point, you just kind of need your own tanks, and you need a good way to attack this push. So this is looking really scary for MVP right now. 4 Vikings, some Marines kind of peppered in there, and 3 tanks. You definitely need to find a way to break this, and most of the time it's just going to be with your own tanks and with staying patient. The Raven especially is going to be a big factor, so you can drop things like point defense drones if you need to, or you can just drop auto turrets when you decide it's time. So he drops the auto turrets just to soak up some tank fire, and he pulls his SCVs just to try to get rid of this as soon as possible. So I think once again MVP just got a little bit impatient. He didn't trade perfectly against this, but even still, you can see the economies are equal, so he still does fine against that. Getting the Blue Flame on his factory now that the Tech Lab is added to it, so double tank production along with double Hellbat production, all really normal stuff. Now MVP is going to try to be a little bit aggressive with his units out on the map here, but not realizing that realizing he can't really do much. So just going to land his 3rd base, get his extra geysers. You should be adding on more factories here fairly soon just to compensate for the new production levels. And then from this point, like I said, all about Mech is just all about not dying for a really long time until they either do something that they shouldn't do or until you have a maxed out army. So from this point, he needs to start adding on turrets around his bases so he doesn't die to drops. He can start spreading his tanks out a little bit. And something that we haven't seen quite yet is we haven't seen a sensor tower to start revealing where the army is coming from, because that's kind of a big factor when you're running Mech, is knowing where the army is going to be collapsing on you from. So Vikings being added in here. Something also you can do that's a little bit advanced that we're not going to talk too much about is you can add on a few dropships to carry Hellbats around in, and then drop on top of the opponent's units. That's something that's pretty high level. You'll see players like Innovation do that a lot, but MVP is not known for doing things like that. He's a little bit more positionally based, not going to be so cute with his Hellbats. He's just going to be a lot more straightforward with this. Here comes MMA moving out with his tanks, and a high tank count is something you definitely still do need to consider, considering these bio plays don't have to just be Marine Marauder drops all the time. So I guess we will address drops and stuff like that in another video, or you can watch the bio video if you want to know more about how aggressive they can be with drops, but it's really just up to you to prevent that. That's why he has a lot of Vikings out, and he should be starting up turrets, at least a few more here in his base. Here's another little Hellbat run by, or rather Hellion run by, just to try to deal a little bit of damage. But from here, as long as you have position, there's not much that the bio player can do. And we're going to see MMA trying to over and over to try and gain this position. And MVP's been dropping constant scans on him, so he knows what's in the army, he knows where it's coming from. There's even another scan to see what's going on. And as long as you have the air control here, their medevacs really can't do much at all. You can try to stim forward there with their Marines, but sometimes you can bait the Marines into the tank fire, which you can see right there, getting wasted. So yeah, it's just really all about finding ways to build up to a point where you can attack. And we're going to watch MVP build up to that point, and it's going to be when he maxes out, because there's not much going on the map right now. It's just MMA seeking position the best he can. See MVP going forward just a little bit to try and deal with this tiny army over here. You don't want to get too much drop, or rather caught. Here's a little bit of a drop doing some damage, but having turrets and, units back there to deal with that will be just fine. So again, we're just waiting for MVP to attack here so we can kind of see how this game's going to go. And again, if I remember right, this is a lot about base trading. This is something that can be annoying to deal with, is the drops from the medevacs on top of your tanks. That's a good way for bio to trade well against tanks, and that's why you really need to make sure that your Hellbats are ready to support, or maybe that your tanks are a little more spread out. And secondarily, you can also unsiege here to try and deal with the drops, but if you do that, then the rest of the army is just going to stim forward and stomp you. So I guess the lesson here is not to leave little chunks of units out here if you don't have to. You'll see that most of his army is actually back here protecting his base. But if you're going to start claiming forward territory, you need to claim that with most of your army, rather than just kind of haphazardly do it, because MMA knows about this, and he knows he can drop on top of this and kind of flush this out pretty easily. So that's exactly what he does, and all of a sudden MVP's supply lead is gone. So just getting a little bit sloppy with his positioning there was MVP, getting a little bit overconfident. And then from the rest of this, it's really just about positioning, it's about absorbing the rest of this attack. MMA is getting super aggressive here, and he's honestly doing a pretty good job. MVP getting a little bit desperate, but still, because he had the good position, because he had a lot of tanks, he still had a decent supply lead. So MMA probably overextending a little bit right after MVP overextended. MVP won a defensive fight, so he's going to start pushing out on the map, and that's kind of a philosophy you can adapt, is that if you ever win a fight at your base, you can start to get on top of theirs, because they have to wait for a while for more units to come out to defend against this, especially if they lost their tanks. So you can see MVP doing this little bit of a leapfrogging action coming forward here, like we talked about in the last game. So you're really just going to move closer and closer to your opponent's base until there's not much more they can do. This is also something that can happen, is they can just decide, I can't fight your army, so I'm just going to base trade the best I can. And if that's the case, you really just need to leave some tanks siege somewhere and kind of protect your infrastructure here in the main the best you can. So the Vikings will be good as far as picking off medevacs if they have any mixed into their army. But again, like we talked about, more drops here. He unsieges the back tanks, but again, MMA does something smart and just stims forward and deals with that. The reinforcements from MVP coming back over here and dealing with that pretty well. So MMA does eventually clean that up with a full surround on the bio, but still MVP prevented mining from this base, forced it to lift off. He's forcing MMA to move around. This is how these games can go. It can be a little bit annoying. A lot of times you won't just win with this first push. So you need to know to keep making bases, something that MVP is kind of slacking on a little bit. Keep making bases, keep building up your army, and keep finding these timings where you can continue to push out. So he's going to, again, claim position that's on a mining base, going to try to eliminate these tanks the best he can. And MVP is still doing really well as far as his positioning, but MMA is a very crafty person, getting another base mining over here and running by with his army just a little bit. So yeah, there's not a whole lot more to talk about. Just kind of keep trying to claim position here with your mech. Keep trying to push forward. Let's just quickly address the battlecruiser situation, which can come up. A lot of times the later game will come down to a lot of starports, and conversely that will include things like Ravens, battlecruisers, etc. If you're the mech player, you actually need to also switch into that if you see that coming. or you need to be a little bit more proactive and just switch into that yourself. I know we talked about an attack timing can be just as soon as you max out you can go, but alternatively you can just stay home and start your battlecruiser tech ahead of the bio player and start to get into things like Banshees and Ravens and stuff like that to start forcing him to have to react to that or have to attack into you while you're still claiming territory. So that's another option you can do, is just go into the super late game stages of TvT if you want to play it out that way and just be turtle mode like the whole game until you have an unstoppable army. But if you're more proactive with your mech, which is a little bit stronger strategy, the bio player might respond to this mech by saying, well, if I can take over the air control, then your tanks are worthless because I can just kill them with Banshees. So if that comes to that point, you need to be ready to start getting into Ravens, Vikings, and stuff like that. So staying on top of what they're doing is important. But the reason that he pushes out with these timings is just to prevent him from comfortably getting into that. So yeah, you just need to know that that transition does exist, but we'll talk about that more in a late game video about TvT in the near future. So thanks for watching this one. I'll be back with more tutorials very soon, and I have a lot more Terran tutorials down in the playlist at the description of the video, so look up, or rather look out for that. And I guess we'll see you guys next time.